In October of 2009, a man named Dale Whitmer stood in a gravel drive in Carroll County, Ohio, and listened to a salvage dealer explain that the old rack and cloth press behind the barn was worth roughly $40 in scrap iron. The dealer had a clipboard. He had a truck idling on the county road. He walked the machine the way a doctor walks a patient. He has already written off, tapping a corroded crossbeam, pressing a thumb into the cracked oak frame, and finally saying, in the patient register of someone who had done this 100 times, that he would do Dale a favor and haul it away without charging for the pickup. Dale thanked him. He did not let him take it. 11 years later, in the fall of 2020, a craft cidery out of Tuscarawas County signed a seasonal use agreement for that same press. They paid $400 for each weekend they ran it, which came to 32 weekends over the following 2 years. The press made them the only cidery in northeastern Ohio pressing heritage apples on period equipment, and they put that fact on every bottle they sold that season. People drove from Pittsburgh and Columbus to watch it work. Dale Whitmer was not a cider maker. He was a retired millwright from a paper plant outside Carrollton, and he was known in his township for 2 things. He had an unnatural patience with broken iron, and he had the ability to tell you from the shape of a corroded casting alone who had made it and approximately when. This is the story of a machine everyone agreed was finished, a man who disagreed quietly, and an inheritance that turned out to be worth more than anyone thought to measure. Let me tell you about rack and cloth pressing, because it is the mechanism that makes everything that follows make sense. A rack and cloth press works differently from the continuous belt presses and bladder presses that came to dominate commercial cideries and juice operations after the 1970s. It is slower. It is older. The basic design dates to the 18th century in England and came to the American Mid-Atlantic and Great Lakes regions with the orchard culture that followed the Appalachian Ridge. The way it works is this. A crew loads ground apple pomace, which is the pulpy mash that comes from milling the fruit, onto wooden racks in a precise alternating stack. Between each layer of pomace goes a cloth, originally burlap or horsehair, and the layers build up into what is called a cheese. That cheese sits under a hydraulic or screw-driven ram, and the press comes down slow, pressing juice through the cloth and out the drainage channels at a rate the fruit rather than the machine controls. A bladder press can finish a batch in 45 minutes. A rack and cloth press typically takes 3 hours or more on the same volume. To the production accountant, this looks like pure inefficiency. To the fermentation chemist, what it actually does is press at lower pressures across a longer time, which releases less of the harsh tannins and oxidized phenolics that make pressed juice bitter and astringent. The juice that comes out of a rack and cloth press at the end of those 3 hours is clearer, sweeter at the base, and more complex in its acid profile than what a bladder press produces under high pressure in under an hour. The old way was not slower because the people who used it were unsophisticated. It was slower because the fruit required it. Dale's grandfather, Harlan Whitmer, had understood this. Harlan had run a small mixed orchard in the eastern end of Carroll County starting in 1941, when he came back from 18 months of defense plant work in Akron, with enough money to put a down payment on 83 acres of hillside ground that nobody else wanted because it faced north and drained poorly, and the soil was thin and stony. What Harlan had seen in that hillside was not a liability. He had seen the same slope exposure and drainage that the old German and Bohemian orchard men had told him about since he was a boy in the township, the same conditions that kept trees from breaking dormancy too early in a late frost year and let the fruit hang an extra 2 and 3 weeks into October before it needed picking. The north-facing hillside was not a handicap. It was a refrigerator built by the topography of the land, and it held the sugar in the fruit, while the valley orchards were already hauling their picked bins to the packing house. He bought the press the year he planted the trees, used from an estate sale in Columbiana County, and he kept records of every pressing in a ledger that he bound himself from salvaged cover boards and butcher paper. The ledger was not a romantic gesture. It was a working document. Harlan recorded the variety or varieties in each batch, the date of pressing, the sugar reading he took in bricks with a refractometer he had bought at a farm auction, the gallonage at first run and at finish, and a short note on the color and clarity of the juice. He also noted, in a column on the right side of each page, what the weather had been doing in the 2 weeks before the pick. He was trying to understand the relationship between the season's temperature pattern and the fruit's sugar accumulation at the time of picking, and he worked at this question for 30 years without arriving at a complete answer. But by the end of the 1970s, his notes had accumulated enough data that certain patterns were undeniable. The North Slope held its sugars longer than the valley floor in every year he had recorded. The best press apples from the hillside orchard reliably ran 2 to 4 degrees, bricks higher than the same variety pressed from lower ground. That difference in sugar content meant a difference in the finished cider's structure and its potential alcohol, and Harlan had understood it as well as any academic study published 50 years later would have. Dale had grown up helping in that orchard. He left for the millwright trade at 19 and came back on weekends and harvest season until Harlan died in 1988. The orchard passed to his aunt, who sold off most of the ground in 1994, but kept the farmstead parcel and the outbuildings, and when she died in 2006, it came to Dale. The press had been sitting under a tarp behind the barn for 18 years by then. 2 of the 4 oak rack frames were split. The hydraulic cylinder had seized. The drainage channel was cracked in 3 places. Most of the cloth had rotted to nothing. The salvage dealer who came in 2009 was not wrong that it was in rough shape. He was simply wrong about what rough shape meant in terms of the machine's future. Dale spent 4 winters on it. He found a millwright's satisfaction in the work that had nothing to do with romance or sentiment. The seized cylinder he pulled, re-sleeved with a machined liner from a shop in Canton, and repacked with modern seals that would outlast him. The cracked oak rack frames he replaced using white oak lumber. He milled himself from 2 trees he had dropped on the property, air-dried for 16 months, and hand-planed to the original dimensions he found in Harlan's ledger, which included a careful diagram of the press drawn in pencil on the inside back cover. The drainage channel he relined with food-grade epoxy, and a stainless steel tray he fabricated himself. The cloth he replaced with food-grade nylon pressing cloth sourced from a cheese-making supply house in Vermont, which turned out to be dimensionally compatible with the original rack size within 1/8 of an inch. He worked on it the way he had worked on the paper plant's machinery for 30 years, methodically and without hurry, solving one problem at a time in the order in which the problems presented themselves, keeping notes on what he found and what he did about it in a small spiral notebook he kept on the workbench. He did not work from nostalgia. He worked from the conviction that a machine built this way from white oak and cast iron, and a hydraulic principle that was simple and correct, had not exhausted its usefulness simply because a cheaper and faster alternative existed. The salvage dealer had priced the press at its scrap weight. Dale was pricing it at what it could still do. By the spring of 2013, the press ran. His neighbor in those years was a man named Roy Kessler, who had farmed the adjacent ground in corn and soybeans for 30 years and was considered by the county extension office to be one of the more forward-thinking operators in the area. Roy had upgraded his equipment twice in the previous decade, running a line of credit to finance a new planter and a grain cart and a used self-propelled sprayer he had brought in from Indiana. He was a good farmer by every measure the system used to evaluate farming, and he genuinely believed that the measures were the right ones. He was not unkind about Dale's project. He was honestly confused by it. He came over the afternoon. Dale ran the press for the first time after the restoration, stood with a coffee cup in his hands, watching the juice run out into the stainless tray, and said, in the tone of a man genuinely trying to be helpful, that he did not see how you made money selling juice to 4 neighbors when you could run 180 acres of corn and soybeans on equipment that actually scaled. Dale handed him a cup of the juice. Roy drank it and was quiet for a moment and then said it was good. He did not come back to revise the rest of his opinion. The man who would eventually give Dale's press its public dismissal arrived in June of 2014. His name was Todd Birch, and he was a regional small farm development coordinator for an agricultural development office out of New Philadelphia, which is the county seat of Tuscarawas County, about 30 miles west of Carrollton. Todd had a graduate degree in agricultural economics from Ohio State and a sincere belief, backed by considerable data from the previous decade of craft beverage market analysis, that the future of small farm cider and juice operations in northeastern Ohio was modern, hygienic, efficient processing equipment that could handle volume. He visited Dale as part of a county-wide assessment of existing small-scale orchard and pressing operations, arrived in a white university-branded pickup, and spent about 40 minutes with the press and with Dale's orchard records before he delivered his assessment. He was not rude about it. That is the important thing to say at the start. Todd Birch was a good-faith man operating inside a framework that had never, in his experience, been wrong about the things it measured. He leaned against the doorframe of the barn and looked at the press the way he might look at a steam-powered thresher in a museum, with appreciation for its historical interest and genuine puzzlement about anyone running it in the present tense. "What you've got here is a sentimental asset," he said. "It's a beautiful piece of equipment. I mean that. For a commercial operation at any kind of scale, though, you're looking at a production bottleneck that the market is going to outrun. The cidery segment is growing fast. The operations that are going to capture that growth are the ones running bladder or belt systems at volume. This is a museum piece, Dale. That's not a criticism. It's just what it is." Dale had been leaning on a shovel handle through most of this. He said, "It makes good juice." Todd smiled in the way of a man who has heard this before and found it charming. "I don't doubt it. I genuinely don't. Good juice and a viable business are 2 different conversations." He left a pamphlet about equipment financing programs for modernizing small-scale operations. Dale put it on the workbench and did not read it. He kept pressing. Most weekends in September and October, he was in the barn by 7 in the morning, milling the previous day's pick and loading the rack. And he finished around 4 in the afternoon with anywhere from 60 to 120 gallons of fresh juice that he would chill overnight and begin selling the following day at the farm stand. He sold out most weekends. The people who came back year after year were not coming because the cider was the cheapest thing available. They were coming because it tasted different from what they could buy anywhere else, different in a way they did not always have words for, except that it was fuller and rounder and seemed to carry more of the fruit than what came out of a plastic jug at the grocery. Dale did not explain the mechanism to them unless they asked. If they asked, he explained it. If you are the kind of person who has ever watched a craft industry find its footing, you might have seen, as Dale occasionally did on drives through the county, the signs going up along the state routes. Small operations with names like Stone Hollow and Ridgeline and Valley Branch, tasting rooms in repurposed barns and old dairy buildings, hand-lettered signs for hard cider and heritage apple juice. The craft cider segment that Todd Birch had cited as a fast-growing market was real, and it was arriving in the hills of northeastern Ohio with a particular character that differed from what the industrial processors had been producing for decades. The people opening these operations were young and credentialed and had done their research, and most of them were pressing on bladder presses and belt presses that they had sourced from West Coast cideries or imported from Europe, and most of them were producing juice that was technically good and difficult to differentiate. The market was growing. The equipment was getting faster. The fruit was being processed at speeds the old orchard men would not have recognized. The cidery that would eventually rent Dale's press was 3 years away from existing when Todd Birch made his assessment. The orchards that would supply it were already there in various states of neglect, scattered across the hillsides of Carroll and Tuscarawas and Holmes counties. Old mixed plantings of heritage varieties that nobody was pressing because nobody had the equipment that did justice to the fruit. There were Rambos and Smokehouses and Roxbury Russets and Northern Spies and a half-dozen varieties that did not appear in any commercial nursery catalog, varieties that had been growing on these hillsides since before the Civil War, whose names existed only in old ledgers and in the memories of the people whose grandparents had planted them. This was the second thing that nobody was measuring. Dale spent the years from 2013 to 2018, pressing mostly for himself and for a small circle of neighbors, producing between 400 and 600 gallons of juice per season and selling fresh cider at the farm stand on weekends in October and November. He also began in the winter of 2014 to compile a systematic record of what varieties he was finding in the old orchards within a 20-mile radius of his place, driving back roads on Sundays and stopping wherever he saw an untended tree. He identified 31 distinct varieties in those 5 years, photographed their fruit, pressed small trial batches, and recorded the juice yield, acid content, sugar reading, and tannin character of each in a notebook that grew to 4 volumes. He had not set out to become a cider scholar. He was a millwright who liked to know how things worked. The notebook was simply a natural extension of that habit. His old dog, a heeler mix named Birch, was always with him on those Sunday drives. Birch would ride in the back of the truck and climb out at each stop and investigate the grass around the base of whatever tree Dale was examining, and occasionally Dale would look up from a branch and find Birch looking back at him with the mild, interested expression of a dog who has learned that his person's activities, however puzzling, tend to end in a drive and a meal. Birch was in the truck the morning Claire Mass first drove out, and he sat on the barn floor between them during her first hour with the notebooks, watching both people with the same steady attention he gave to everything he did not entirely understand. The cidery in question was founded in 2017 by a woman named Claire Mast, who had grown up in Sugar Creek, studied fermentation science at a small program in Vermont, and come back to Tuscarawas County with the intention of making traditional cider from heritage fruit. Claire was 31 when she started Millstone Cider. She had 4 investors, a leased production space in a repurposed dairy building outside Newcomerstown, a bladder press she had sourced from a California cidery that was upgrading to a larger unit, and a problem she had not anticipated. The bladder press was handling her heritage fruit in a way that flattened it. The Roxbury Russets and the Northern Spies came out of the bladder press, producing a juice that was technically fine and completely indistinct, The tannins were harsh. The acid profile was aggressive. The complexity she had tasted in the fruit when she chewed it raw was not making it through to the juice, and she spent 2 fermentation seasons trying to compensate with different yeast strains and finishing techniques before she admitted to herself that the problem was upstream of fermentation. It was in the pressing itself. She had begun asking around about rack and cloth presses when a neighbor of Dale's mentioned his name. Claire drove out to Carroll County on a Tuesday morning in March of 2019 and found Dale in the barn doing winter maintenance on the press. She looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then she asked if she could see the pressing records. He brought out the 4 notebooks. She spent an hour with them at the workbench. When she looked up, she said, "You've been tasting these side by side against modern pressed juice." "When I can," Dale said. "How different is it?" "Depends on the variety," he said. "On the russets and the spies, it's not subtle." She came back 3 weeks later with 6 gallons of Roxbury russet pomace she had milled herself and asked if she could run a test pressing. Dale said yes. They ran the batch through the press over the course of an afternoon, and Claire took the juice home and fermented a 5-gallon trial batch alongside a 5-gallon batch fermented from juice she had pressed on her bladder unit, from fruit out of the same orchard pick, same day, same yeast. She did a blind tasting with 3 people whose palates she trusted 6 weeks later. The rack and cloth batch won without a close vote. That spring, 2019, was also the spring when Roy Kessler's situation began to change. Roy had been carrying his equipment financing through an operating line that he had extended twice in the previous 4 years as corn margins tightened and input costs climbed. The interest rate environment through most of that period had been manageable, but in the fall of 2018, the rate on his line had adjusted upward, and he had borrowed against the next year's crop to cover the renewal. Then, the spring of 2019 was one of the wettest on record across the eastern Ohio crop belt. Roy's ground, which drained toward a low creek bottom, was not fit to enter until the 2nd week of June. He planted late into wet soil, and the stand was uneven, and when the price of corn weakened further by August, he was looking at a season where his gross income would not cover his input costs, plus his line of credit service. He did not lose the farm. He came close. He sold the self-propelled sprayer to cover the shortfall, which meant contracting custom application the following year at a cost that erased most of what the equipment sale had gained him. The sprayer that had looked like a sound investment in 2011, when corn was running near $7 a bushel and the margins seemed to justify the debt, had become by 2019 a machine he could not afford to run on prices that had dropped below $4 and stayed there for 3 consecutive years. By the fall of 2019, he was a man who had followed every piece of credentialed advice available to him for 30 years and had arrived at a thinner margin than the year he started. He had done everything right by the standards that measured rightness, and the standards had not been sufficient. Dale did not say anything about this. He helped Roy move the sprayer onto the dealer's trailer and handed him a jug of fresh cider and went home. The seasonal rental agreement between Dale and Claire Mast at Millstone Cider was formalized in the winter of 2019, covering the pressing seasons of 2020 and 2021. The terms were simple: $400 per pressing weekend, Dale providing the press and the operational knowledge, Claire providing the fruit, the crew, and the transport. The agreement also included a provision that Dale had insisted on and Claire had accepted without negotiation, which was that he would be present for every pressing and that the notebooks would be available to the Millstone crew to consult. He was not trying to protect a trade secret. He simply understood that the press had a particular logic, a sequence of rack loading and pressure application and drainage timing that he had worked out over 6 years, and that running it incorrectly would damage the juice and possibly the equipment. He also understood, though he would not have put it this way, that the notebooks were the thing that connected the machine to the ground it had come from, and that without that connection, the press was just old iron. Todd Birch had come back once in the summer of 2018 to check in on what he described in his assessment notes as a legacy pressing operation in Carroll County. He spent an hour with Dale and looked at the farm stand records and tasted a glass of the previous year's stored cider and said, more carefully than he had said things in 2014, that he thought there might be a niche market case for what Dale was doing, particularly if heritage variety documentation was involved. He mentioned a small farm differentiation grant program that his office had been running for 2 years. Dale thanked him and said he would think about it. He did not apply for the grant. He did not need to differentiate. He had been pressed out every October for 5 years running. The third time Todd came to Carroll County, he came in October of 2020, at the end of the first full season under the rental agreement with Millstone. Someone from the Farm Bureau had mentioned the purchase order from the Cleveland retailer, and Todd's office had a standing interest in documenting successful small farm value-added operations. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon and stood in the barn for a while without saying much, watching Dale run the drainage on the last batch of the season. The press was nearly done. The juice had been running for 3 hours. Todd stood with his hands in his pockets and watched the golden amber fluid moving out of the cloth and into the tray, and after a time he said it looked different from what he expected. Dale handed him a cup of the fresh pressed juice, the way he had handed Roy a cup 7 years earlier. Todd held it up against the light coming through the barn door. He tasted it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I think I may have underestimated what this was." Dale looked up from the rack. He said, "It's a good press." Todd was quiet again. Then he asked what it took, the knowledge side of it, to run a machine like this correctly. He was not asking rhetorically. He was writing something in a small notebook. Dale told him it could be learned, that it took a while, that the sequence of loading and pressure and drainage timing was particular to the fruit variety and the state of the fruit on a given day, and that you got a feel for it over time that you could not get from reading about it. Todd wrote that down. He thanked Dale and shook his hand and went back to New Philadelphia. The article he published in the quarterly newsletter that winter described the press as a working example of technique-based differentiation in a crowded craft segment, and it cited the Cleveland purchase order by volume. He did not describe it as a museum piece. The 2020 pressing season was the first full season under the rental agreement with Millstone. Claire brought 2 crew members and a full orchard pick of heritage fruit on the first Saturday of October. They loaded the first cheese by 8 in the morning, and by 11 the press was running, and the juice was coming out at a rate and a clarity that stopped one of the crew members mid-sentence while she was telling Claire something about the fermentation schedule. She looked at the tray and said quietly that she had not seen juice come off a press that color before. Dale was at the drainage channel, adjusting the tray angle. He did not look up. He said that the color was the tannin balance, that the slow press released the soluble tannins without forcing the harsh, astringent ones that came out under high pressure, and that the color would deepen slightly by the 3rd hour. The crew member watched him for a moment, then she went back to loading. Birch spent that first pressing season lying at the edge of the barn door with his chin on his paws, watching the people work with the mild and patient attention that he gave to everything he found interesting, but had not yet decided was his business. He was 12 years old that season, which is old for a working dog, and he moved around the barn with the deliberate care of an animal who has decided that unnecessary steps are not worth making. When the pressing was finished, and the crew was loading the juice containers into their van, Birch walked over to Claire and stood beside her ankle for a moment. She put her hand on his head. He walked back to Dale's side and lay down. Now let me tell you what the press actually meant in that 2020 season, because the number matters and the number does not become real until you know what it was sitting next to. The county average yield for Heritage Apple, pressing operations using modern bladder equipment in northeastern Ohio that year, ran to approximately $7 per gallon of finished juice, which was itself a respectable figure for small-scale production. Operations running high-volume belt press setups averaged closer to $4.50 per gallon because volume drove price down in the commercial channels where most of that juice went. Millstone Cider, pressing on the rack and cloth, was producing a juice that the cidery was able to differentiate on flavor profile, press method, and variety specificity. They bottled their Roxbury Russet single variety under a label that named the press and named Dale's County and named the year the equipment had been made, which was 1923. They sold that bottle at $19 retail. The number that came across the workbench that November was not a juice per gallon figure. It was a purchase order. A specialty bottle retailer in Cleveland had placed an order for 480 cases of the single variety Heritage line, citing the pressing method as the primary reason for the placement. 480 cases. Claire showed it to Dale on her phone, standing at the workbench with the last of the season's pressing still drying on the cloth frames. He read it twice. He set the phone down on the workbench. He said, "That's a lot of bottles." Claire laughed. She said it was. She said that without the press, she could not fill the order in a way that justified the price point. She said she needed to talk to him about the 2022 season. It was not a dramatic moment. It did not feel like a verdict being read. It felt like a machine doing what it had been built to do. 3/4 of a century after the man who bought it had written its dimensions in pencil on the inside back cover of a hand-bound ledger. Dale called his daughter that evening. Her name was Meg, and she had studied biology at Ohio University and was working for a soil testing lab in Columbus. He did not call her often about the farm. He told her about the purchase order and about the season the press had run. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, I want to come up and see the press run." She came the following October. She stood in the barn the way Claire had stood in the barn 2 years before, looking at the machine without saying much. She helped load the cheese on the second rack. She watched the press come down and the juice begin to move. She asked Dale about the variety records in the notebooks, and he went through the 4 volumes with her over dinner that night. The notebooks spread on the kitchen table under the hanging light while Birch settled at their feet. She asked questions he had not thought anyone would ask. She asked about the soil association of the orchards where he had found the best fruit, about the correlation between north-facing exposure and late-season sugar accumulation, about whether any of the unnamed varieties he had cataloged matched the description of lost varieties documented in pre-Prohibition Ohio pomology reports she had read as an undergraduate. Dale sat back in his chair and looked at her across the table. He said he did not know, but that they could find out. She asked if she could take one of the notebooks back to Columbus. He said she could take whichever one she needed. She took Volume 2, which covered the 2015 and 2016 pressing records and included the most detailed variety notes. She returned it 8 weeks later with 30 pages of her own notes tucked inside the front cover, and a question about whether Dale had ever thought about having the unnamed varieties formally characterized. He said he had not thought about it that way, but that he was open to it. The following spring, she connected him with a pomology researcher at the Ohio State Agricultural Research and Development Center in Worcester, who had been working on a heritage variety identification project. The researcher, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Pauline Roth, drove out to Carroll County in April of 2022 and spent a day walking the identified orchard sites with Dale. She took cuttings from 7 of the unnamed trees. By August, she had matched 2 of them to varieties listed as commercially extinct in the USDA pomological manuscripts from 1905. One was a press apple known in pre-1900 Ohio orchard culture as the Canfield Pippin, last recorded in commercial production in 1913. The other had no historical name on record and was given a working designation pending formal botanical documentation. Dr. Roth published her initial findings in a regional pomology journal in the spring of 2023. The paper cited Dale's pressing records as the primary field documentation for both varieties. Roy Kessler read about it in the County Farm Bureau newsletter. He came over on a Wednesday evening and sat at the kitchen table and asked Dale how the rental arrangement worked. Dale explained it. Roy was quiet for a while. He said he had 3 acres of old mixed orchard on the back of his property that his father had planted in the 1960s and that he had always thought of as a nuisance because the fruit was small and irregular and he could not sell it to the commercial packing house. Dale told him to bring a sample over in September when the fruit came in, and he would tell him what he had. Roy brought a bushel basket in the first week of September 2023. Dale milled a small sample on the hand mill he kept in the barn and tasted the juice at the press. He went inside and came back with Volume 3 of the notebooks. He found the entry from October 2016 and held it next to the cut fruit and read the color description. He told Roy that he was fairly confident the majority planting was Northern Spy, which was a good press apple with a strong acid backbone, and that there appeared to be a secondary variety mixed in that he would need to see at full ripeness to be certain of. Roy sat on the fender of Dale's old truck and looked at the basket of apples. He said quietly, "You think Claire would take them?" Dale said he would ask. He asked. Claire said yes, conditionally, pending a trial pressing. The trial pressing happened on a Saturday in late October. The juice came out of the rack and cloth press with a profile that Claire described to her fermentation team as close to the best spy juice they had ever worked with, and considerably more interesting because of the secondary variety threading through it. She offered Roy a purchasing agreement for the following season at a price per bushel that was 4 times what the packing house had paid him on the years he had bothered to sell the fruit at all. Roy drove back to his farm without saying much. He called Dale that night and said he was going to stop thinking of those 3 acres as a nuisance. There were 4 other growers who came to Dale that fall, people he had known for years who had old orchard sections they had been mowing around for a decade because they saw no use in the fruit. 3 of them brought samples. One brought Dale's notebooks back to him after having asked to borrow Volume 1 6 months earlier, and said, with some embarrassment, that he had not realized what was in them. Dale told him there was no reason he would have. It was not the kind of thing that showed up in the extension bulletins. He did not try to expand the operation beyond what the press and the orchard calendar would accommodate. Claire had asked in the spring of 2022 whether he had considered a second press, a larger unit, something that could handle the volume, the growing millstone operation, would eventually need. Dale listened to her lay out the case. The demand was real. The price per bottle was holding. The differentiation story was working better than anyone had projected. A second press at the right scale could triple the throughput. He thought about it for a week and then told her no. He told her that what the press produced depended on how it was run, and that what it produced at the right volume in his barn was not what it would produce at 3 times the volume in a facility he did not manage on a Saturday morning in October. He told her that the value was in the practice, not just the equipment, and that the practice had a natural ceiling. She respected it. She sourced supplemental volume from a restored press in Wayne County the following season, a unit belonging to a retired dairy farmer who had bought it at an estate sale in 2015 and rebuilt the hydraulics himself. She sent Dale the man's name. Dale drove out to meet him on a Tuesday in March and spent an afternoon looking at the machine. They were talking about pressing technique within 20 minutes of meeting. Dale left him with a photocopy of Harlan's ledger pages on bricks measurement timing. The Wayne County man called back 3 weeks later with a question about cloth tension. Dale answered it. This is also how knowledge moves. Not in one direction, from a machine to a market, but out and across from one barn to another, from a hand-bound ledger to a photocopied page, from a Tuesday afternoon conversation to a phone call in April. Harlan had understood this too in his way. He had given cuttings from his best trees to 3 neighbors in the 1950s, and those trees were still standing on those properties when Dale drove back roads on Sunday afternoons 40 years later. There are 2 kinds of knowledge that collide in a story like this one, and they are worth naming plainly at the end, because the collision is the whole point. The first kind operates by abstraction and aggregation. It measures what is easy to count, which is production volume, equipment cost per unit, market segments growing at a measurable rate, the price spread between a bladder press running 45 minutes per batch and a rack and cloth press running 3 hours. This kind of knowledge is sincere, genuinely useful within its frame, and tends to be held with a confidence proportional to how many times it has been correct in the situations it was designed for. Todd Birch was not a careless man. He was a careful man whose instruments were calibrated to measure certain things and not others. The second kind is made from time and attention to a particular piece of ground. It is not nostalgic, and it is not romantic, though it sometimes looks those things from the outside. It is observational in the strictest sense. Harlan Whitmer noticed that north-facing hillside orchards held their fruit longer. He wrote that observation down in a ledger he made himself. He pressed the juice from those trees through a machine whose slow pressure did not crush what made the fruit worth pressing. Dale Whitmer understood that the ledger and the machine were the same object, that one without the other was just iron and paper. The research paper that Dr. Roth published in 2023 did not discover those varieties. It documented what a retired millwright's 30-year neighbor had been walking past on his way to plant corn. The measure of a thing is not always the thing's value. Dale still runs the press himself on the weekends. Millstone uses it. He is 67 years old. He moves around the barn with the efficiency of a man who has done a task so many times it has become anatomical, who does not need to think about the order of operations because his hands already know the sequence. Meg came back for the 2023 season and worked alongside him for 3 weekends, and on the last Sunday, she asked him to walk her through the pressure application sequence one more time from the beginning, and he did, and she took notes in the same small notebook she had been keeping since her first visit. She has been asking him about grafting stock from the Canfield Pippin trees. He told her the grafting window was March, and that he would show her how. The ledger that Harlan started in 1941 sits on the shelf in the farmhouse kitchen, beside the 4 volumes Dale added to it. The binding is worn, but the pages are dry. The last entry in Harlan's hand is dated October 14th, 1987, the fall before he died, and it records a pressing of mixed heritage fruit from the Carroll County hillside orchard. The yield in gallons, the sugar reading in bricks, a note on the color of the juice at first run, and at the bottom of the page, in the careful script of a man who did not waste words, the observation that the North Slope held its sugars 3 weeks longer than the valley floor, and that this was not an accident of the season, but a property of the ground. That is what he left. Not acreage, not equipment at market value. The knowledge of where the value was, written down in a language anyone could read, waiting for someone who knew it was worth reading. Birch died in the spring of 2022, in his 14th year, on a warm afternoon in April, when the first bloom was coming on the old trees at the upper end of the property. Dale buried him at the field edge under a smokehouse apple that Harlan had planted in 1948. He did not say anything at the time. He came back inside and washed his hands at the barn sink, and stood at the window for a while looking out at the trees coming into flower, and then he went back to work. The press runs every October. The juice comes out clear. The notebooks sit on the shelf. And what was almost $40 in scrap iron turns out to have been all along the one thing in that barn nobody knew how to price.